Hey, my name is Joel. This video is a companion video to one I did on bass drum tuning on my drum channel, RecordingDotPizza, and I'll link to that below because while this is geared toward miking and processing and basically getting the sound, whether for live or for recording, setting up the instrument itself is really critical. And while a lot of engineers would generally leave that to the drummer, I recommend if you actually work with recording and miking drums on a regular basis, if you are not hands-on with the instrument itself, I recommend you go check out that video. I'll link to it below in the description because drummers, I'm a drummer myself and obviously I love drummers dearly. But we drummers sometimes don't really fully understand all the nuances of tuning our instrument because they don't have to be tuned to be played. And I've had a lot of drummers that I've recorded who are fantastic players, but don't really understand how to tune their instruments to get what they want. And that particular video was not just tuning the drum in general, it was really tuning the drum to be mic'd and to be processed. And so this video is the miking and processing part of that. If you want to learn how to kind of set up the drum itself to tune it and muffle it to optimize it for getting these sounds, I definitely highly recommend that you go and check out that video. Okay, so I will first start with a description of the microphones that I'm using. I will say that the bass drum itself is a 24 by 14. So by modern standards, it's a pretty shallow drum because most modern drums are 16 to 18 inches deep. I like 14-inch deep drums because they tend to have a sort of a bigger bloom on the bottom end when they're recorded, certainly from the front mic. It's just kind of my experience. And it is a late 70s. It's a very heavy drum, late 70s Ludwig maple poplar. Won't go too into that, but just to let you know, it's a 24-inch drum. It's not your average 22, and it is a little bit shallower. Here I am talking about the mics. So I'm micing up the drum now, and this is the outside mic, obviously, it's outside, and this is where I've got it placed. It's a large diaphragm condenser microphone that is about 3 fingers or so off the front head. It's definitely not in front of the hole because the hole is going to produce a lot of wind coming out of it. I want it to capture the head resonating, so it's pointed at the head, it's close. The proximity effect of the directionality of the mic is going to make the low end bloom a little bit more. And accentuate it. The mic itself is a cheap Chinese mic. I've modified the circuit because I can't leave well enough alone. And the capsule is actually taken from an old Sony C500 microphone, which it's an old condenser that Sony used to make, 50 years ago. And I like it on the outside of a bass drum, but I'll use almost any large diaphragm condenser. People often get really wound up. I've got to have a FET 47 or I've got to have some variant thereof or whatever. Not really true for me. Almost any large diaphragm condenser tends to work really well, and as an engineer, I'm able to kind of pull out of what I want. And this is really just capturing the sort of indistinctly tuned sustain from the front head, just kind of capturing some low-end weight. A lot of processing can go into this mic to really shape the tone of the bass drum. I'll show you that later. For the inside, I'm using a pretty standard mic, just an AKG D112, the classic egg, and I'm just going to put it inside the mic, just inside the hole, and I'm going to aim it sort of at the back corner of the drum. I could point it directly at the beater and it would get more snap. It's amazing just by turning it a little bit though and focusing it back toward this kind of rear corner of the drum. You get a little more balance of the snap to the body of the drum, and there's really not a lot of body to be had from the inside of a bass drum anyway, as you will hear when you hear this. You can dial a lot in with some EQ and make the inside a good, useful sound. But as it is, it's really mostly attack, and that's great because this is mostly body, and the two together, balancing and processing, I can really create what I want from the drum. So this is really the placement that I'm using, and right now it has just the basic muffling that does allow the front head to resonate a bit. So that's the placement on the drum, and if you haven't watched the other video, the bass drum basically has enough tension on the back head to have a nice solid low end. It's not dead and flat, like works fairly well actually with 22-inch and smaller bass drums, but it's got more tension on it, enough to give it a nice low end, and then the front is really just above finger tight with almost no muffling at all, single ply head so that it rattles a little bit. And the reason I like that is because I like that resonance from the front mic is going to give you the opportunity to add some what I call bloom to the sound And this is kind of sort of the finished product of what that might sound like. By the way, headphones are fine, but this is kind of a visceral experience. I really recommend that you get some speakers, something that's got nice low frequency reproduction, not like a subwoofer that you've got cranked up and, you know, your bass and your treble on your stereo. Flatten that out, but just a good broad range speaker system so you can kind of feel what I'm doing here. So you've got nice articulation, lots of snap and definition on that kick. But you've got that almost kind of a delayed sense of low frequency bloom. Okay, that's coming off the front head. That's the front head right there, which is that thin, papery, single ply head that sounds probably weird in the room, particularly if you tap on it with a drumstick or your finger or something. You're thinking, I need to muffle this. No, you really don't, because this is really from the microphone's perspective, and this is a condenser microphone on this particular performance. This is what it sounds like. So it's definitely not papery and bright. Now this is processed. So let's go back, have a little bit of fun here. I'm going to turn the EQ off of both of these mics. I will say, notice that I have the phase button. That's a term that Neve used. This is a model based on a Neve Class A channel amp. I use the word polarity because polarity is independent of frequency. It's absolute. Phase, technically, from an engineering perspective, is related to frequency. So anyway, basically I have the polarity out here. It's out of polarity. And the reason I've done that, again, if you have a visceral playback system like speakers where you can feel what you're listening to, low frequency instruments tend to reveal absolute polarity. People say they can't hear polarity, they can't hear phase. You can hear it if you have two mics on one source and one's out of phase, then you hear that, but just one signal by itself, whether it's in or out of polarity, you can't hear it. That's kind of true generally, but when it comes to low frequencies, to me, I can sort of feel it on a good playback system with good low frequency response, because one will have a more visceral feel, whereas flip to polarity and now you're hearing it. It sounds the same, but one of them you feel, one of them you don't. And so anytime I'm getting drum sounds, whether I'm recording them or doing live sound, or if I'm mixing something that someone else has recorded and they send it to me, the first thing I'm going to do is start with the bass drum and check the absolute polarity. Basically, I'm going to pick the one that feels more dynamic to me, more visceral to me, and I'm going to work from there through all the other mics of the kit. Now, I'm not going to do that right here, but I'm just showing you that's why I'm actually turning off the EQ, but leaving the plugin active with the polarity button, because that's how I had it set up. So anyway, this is the outside mic with no processing other than flipping the polarity. So it's not a super amazing sound. Similarly, the inside mic by itself, not an amazing sound. Now notice, what do you get mostly from that? It's attack, right? A lot of definition. Do you hear the front head flapping around? No, you hear the snare drum leakage. That's not unusual. The snare is just on the other side of the batter head. But the inside mic is going to be primarily attack. Now, if you have a deeper bass drum and the mic is sort of toward the front of the drum, as it is here, but if you have a drum that's deeper, there's a little more room for the low frequency to develop. However, the overall presentation of those drums, like I say, for some reason doesn't seem to have the same extension on the low end that shallower drums do, particularly from the outside mic. And I get the body and the bottom end from the outside mic. In fact, Yamaha years ago came up with the sub-kick mic, which is a speaker wired in reverse, and people have been doing tricks like that with speakers for a long time, and that definitely picks up the low frequency. That's a little over the top for me. I prefer a good, condenser mic on the outside to get the weight. But the inside mic is mostly attack, and in fact, I did a video on this channel before it was RecordingDotPizza, before I even really had an idea of what I wanted to do with the channel, but like 7-8 years ago, I did a bass drum tuning video, right? I was going to show people how I tune a bass drum. And it wasn't until I got to the end just about of the actual videoing of tuning the bass drum that it occurred to me, oh, people probably want to hear this thing. So I'll stick a mic in it. again, not thinking ahead. It pays off to plan these things, you know. But I didn't. And so I stuck a mic in it. And of course, I'm getting, you know, all attack. And there was no muffling in it too. So it was actually pretty nasty sounding because the high frequencies are bouncing all around inside the hard sealed interior. And if you don't have something soft to absorb those high frequencies, it takes on a basketball-like ping effect or whatever. And so that was nasty. So I thought, okay, well, that's useless, and people are going to think the drum sounds terrible, so I'll throw a little bit of foam in there, which is what I normally do, just to kind of absorb those high frequencies and contain them a little bit. And then you have good raw material, and I don't know that I pointed that out to people, raw material for recording and doing all the processing and the stuff that you want to do. But I talked about tuning the bass drum, and I probably should have made very clear that I'm not getting a finished bass drum sound. I'm not saying, here's how to get a great bass drum sound. It was how to tune a bass drum. So people listen to that, people who did not have much experience, I guess, with miking and recording bass drums, because they were pretty underwhelmed, to say the least. And I got a lot of hate, I guess, on that video, which I thought was pretty funny. I think my favorite comment was from someone who said, this video should be called How to Make a 24-inch Bass Drum Sound Like a Click Track. So, needless to say, the inside of the bass drum is mostly going to be attack. And the outside is where the rest of the body is going to come from. But again, that's pretty subdued. It's pretty mellow. We like our drums hyped. So let's hype these things. So first and foremost, on the inside, I'm going to add, I've got some 60 cycle here, and what's that, 4.8? I don't have my readers on, but about 5K, you know, some snaps, some attacks. So let me put the EQ in. All right, that's starting to sound a little bit more like a bass drum. Let's go back over here to the outside mic and do kind of the same thing with the low frequency. I'm going to add some low shelf, 60 cycles, and then I'm going to cut, looks like 700 hertz, sort of kind of a mid-range, low-mid, to scoop that out a little bit, get rid of some of the boxiness. Now that sounds like a pretty nice, tight bass drum. And that's entirely usable. And if you have a nice rich bass guitar, you know, you could probably turn the kick up overall to have that attack felt a little more with some nice low end from the bass. But I like to go a little further. The reason I don't muffle that outside head is because I want it to bloom a little bit. So I've got this plug-in here that Sound Toys makes. I'm a big fan. By the way, I have no affiliation with any of these companies. These are just things that I actually use. But I love this device. It is modeled on the Altec 1567 vacuum tube mixer. It's a line or mic mixer, depending upon what transformers you loaded the thing with from back in the 60s. And this doesn't have channels on it, but it's basically the global EQ and the input and output drive. And you can select which transformer model you want here. I've got the mic model that I'm using currently. But this thing is super cool because being a tube device, if you drive the input, particularly driving the bass and treble, adding a lot of level to it, you're going to get sort of that tube distortion, which doesn't really sound like distortion, but you run out of headroom and it really limits the dynamic range. So at this point, it's like I'm compressing and EQing at the same time, and harmonic generation, second and third order harmonic, kind of all at once with this plugin, which is really, really cool. So this is what this sounds like. It's without it, and I'll put it in. Oh. Okay, that's just cool. That sounds and feels so nice. And for that reason, I absolutely adore this plugin. It really does everything to the outside of that drum that I want, pretty much just right here by pushing the bass, pushing the treble even. You don't really hear it, but there's something about, I can't say that it adds attack when I mean, it does sound like it's kind of crapping out at the top a little bit with that treble up. Anyway, it's a glorious sound, but if you don't have this plugin, no fear. You can emulate what this thing is doing with just EQ and compression, so I'll bypass this. And here's another EQ I'm adding to my previous EQ. This first EQ is just the general processing of the drum. The second EQ I'm using primarily because I'm replacing the radiator with it. If I wasn't going to use the radiator plugin and I was actually going to do what I'm showing you now, I may not bring up a second EQ plugin. I may just be more exaggerated with the settings on the one that I already have. But for the sake of demonstration, I can add the lows and the highs, right? The shelving that I did with that Sound Toys plugin. And that sounds like this. Okay, so you're getting that. That's nice. It's punchy. And then you can use a compressor, generally a fast compressor, to kind of bite off the attack a little, and a pretty fast release. So it's the same kind of thing that I was doing with the radiator plugin. It doesn't have so much the distortion characteristics. You can certainly use any kind of distortion or harmonic plugin to add more interest to the sound. But the idea is that I'm compressing or limiting that outside mic and layering it in to really give some sustain and some bloom to the overall sound. Now, when you do that, that mic's on the outside of the bass drum. It's picking up whatever's in the room. It is, like the inside mic, picking up the snare drum as well. And sometimes that can become offensive. Right now, it doesn't really seem like it. But if I were to take the room mics out, the snare is not totally in your face from a texture perspective. So what I will often do is sidechain a compressor, a very fast compressor, off the top snare mic. So that snare mic is like, an inch or two away from the head, and the bass drum mics are at least, a foot or so away, or 2 feet maybe, from the snare drum. So it takes sound longer to reach those mics than this one. So by using this to sidechain, I can effectively bite or remove, bite off the front end of that sound from those mics, reducing the leakage. So that would sound sort of like this. You're still getting, you can hear the snare, but there's a little more there. And you're thinking, well, Joel, that doesn't really make a big difference. Well, it may or may not. Sometimes it makes a huge difference. You'd be surprised. And I do that for both bass drum mics because the inside mic is even closer to the snare drum, and it's only separated by a batter head, which is usually like, 10, 15 mil thick at the most. So now, doing that sidechain trick on both bass drum mics, the snare is, without turning it up, it's more in the middle of the mix. So this isn't so much about mixing snare drum, but by how you process the bass drum, you can reveal the snare drum and gives you more power over it. And then you can put the room mics back in. So that's a really cool sound. So whether you're using EQ and compression, or whether you're using a harmonic, plug-in, sort of like the radiator, I like to mess with that outside mic. Now, what if you record the bass drum, you set it up like that, it's all tuned and muffled this way, but you decide in the mix, or maybe you get tracks from someone else that they've recorded this way, and you decide when you're mixing that you do not want all of that bloom. What can you do about it? Well, there's a couple things. First of all, you can get rid of the outside mic and just use the inside mic, which obviously, again, is all attack, so you're going to want to go up with the low frequency a bit. And you can compress that and do some harmonic. You can put the Sound Toys plug-in on this and kind of get some more interest from the sound. But I still like to use that outside mic and just not really compress it, for one thing. And so without compressing it, it's still nice and weighty, but maybe that's still a little too messy. I will just say, just notice, even though that head is basically unmuffled and free to rattle, it's not really in the way. Nevertheless, if you want a deliberately short sound, there are a couple of things you can do. Since this is a dynamics processor, I can actually just use it as a noise gate. This is fully comprehensive. It does have a gate on it. So I can use the noise gate. But I will say, when you try to noise gate the outside of a bass drum, there's not really a strong attack, because that head is really kind of blocking the mic's view of the actual attack, and it's softening it tremendously. As you can tell, there's not a lot of attack on that sound. And attack is very useful for controlling noise gates. So what I will do typically instead is, like I've done over here, I've got a pre-fader send on the inside bass drum mic, which will have plenty of attack. The inside mic has tons of attack. And I'm going to use it with an external key to control this. So I have selected bus 20. I'm going to do bus 23 because that's what the bass drum is. And then do an external control on the noise gate. So, and setting this up is a little bit fiddly. There's not really a setting that I can give you that's going to work consistently, but basically, you want a slow enough attack that really the attack of the internal mic is kind of by itself briefly before the body of the outside mic happens. Otherwise, if the two happen together, it can be kind of fluffy sounding and weird, like if I use a faster attack. It gets sort of blurred sounding. If I slow the attack a little, it's more articulate. It leaves the inside mic really owning the attack, followed quickly, milliseconds later, by the outside. And then it's still cutting off. The noise gate's removing it. Without the gate, you can tell there's more length there. So you can use a gate to shorten it and give it a more overall defined sound, still with a nice bit of weight to it. But again, you got to kind of fiddle with the time constants a little bit. Pretty quick release. It's cutting off about, I'm really using an expansion kind of concept instead of gating. Gating is turning on and off, open and close. This is really just knocking off about, 9 to 10 dB or so. So play with that. See what you think of that. Let's move on to the other muffling that I had. If you want a shorter sound, as a lot of pop music or country music, you often want just sort of a low frequency thump that sort of hits and goes away, nice attack, all that stuff. I'm going to use the same mics, the same tuning, but I'm adding a blanket. This is sort of a medium weight. It's kind of like a soft packing blanket. I don't think it's actually a packing blanket. Not sure exactly what it is. But use what you got. The idea is not really to bury the drum in a lot of fluffy mass, but just really to position this inside so that it's stopping the action of both heads. So each one can kind of breathe a little bit, but then they cut off pretty quickly because they just can't compete with the fluffy mass pressed against them. All right, that's pretty good. So it's a much shorter sound. And I'm going to put this mic back in, obviously. Same positioning, kind of aimed just inside the hole, aimed back this way. And by the way, a lot of people like to put the mic directly in front of the hole. You may or may not like that sound, but that's really the sound of wind hitting the microphone. That's not the sound of the bass drum. It's not the sound of audio or waveforms, in the air. That's the sound of wind pushing against the diaphragm of the mic, because when this drum is played, a ton of wind comes out this hole. So by putting the mic inside, the wind kind of goes around. You avoid that and really just capture the sound of the drum. Okay, so here's the other tuning or the other muffling that I did in that video. There's an additional blanket added to the inside, still a double-headed drum, still mics from the inside and outside, same mics, same positions, but the outside mic is now muffled, so you don't have that extension and that length, that sustain that the drum had in the previous examples. And basically setting it up, for the most part, the same way, including the harmonic compressed vibe of the radiator plug-in here. This is the sound. So still a lot of heft from the outside mic, even though there's not really any length to it. If I mute it, you definitely miss it. You can certainly use the inside mic only. Go more extreme with the settings, you know, depending upon the bass in the song, that may work really, really well. I still like the bit of heft the outside mic gives it. It feels more natural to me, and it feels deeper. Not so fake low end, but more like a natural sense of low end. And the same, really the same stuff applies here. There's just not that much in the way of extension or length time-wise that you're going to get from it. But, you know, killing the radiator and using the separate EQ and compression plugins, it's the same kind of thing. In fact, I would argue this is actually a little bit nicer if the sound that you want is defined and tight, but a nice low end. I could use more of that low. Maybe not that much. And you can always add more attack to the inside mic. So that's a good, solid, tight sound. Processing again is just kind of nip and tuck here and there. It's not dramatically different. And that's a world of difference than the dry sound, unaffected, unprocessed. A lot different. But it doesn't really take much. If the drum is tuned well for the sound, for the character that you want, and mic'd well with appropriate choices in microphones, then you don't have to do that much to really bring it to life and make it fit your mix. So I hope that that is useful for you drummers who are recording yourself more now because technology allows you to do so. Or for people, you know, who've been working with drums or will continue to work with drums. Maybe you're not a drummer, but you're a producer and engineer. Hopefully that's useful, helpful stuff. I appreciate you watching this video. This is my first video since kind of rebooting this channel a little bit, renaming it and bringing it back to life. I hadn't posted anything in a while, wasn't really sure what I was going to do with it, but now that I started Drum.Pizza, my drum channel last year, and have been growing that, I've really wanted to do more recording related stuff. A lot of it having to do with drums. I think people often, particularly young engineers, will too often reach for drum libraries, either to replace sounds with samples or for just programming things outright. And I understand that's very, very popular in pop music right now, but things are sort of cyclical. Live playing's kind of coming back. And being able to come up with some of your own sounds rather than relying on libraries and other people's work and sounding like other people, learning to kind of manipulate these elements and really create sounds in your mind, you start to understand the raw material you need to then process a certain way to get the sound, to realize that sound that you've got in your head. This channel is going to be dealing with that. It won't be just dealing with drums, but because I am a drummer, it'll probably have a lot of things that deal with drums. Drums is probably one of the trickier things to capture and to process and to mix. So I think this is hopefully going to be a really useful channel for a lot of audio professionals. But I will also deal with other things as well. I have in mind a video that I'll be doing in the next month or so that I think is going to be a lot of fun, particularly for young recording engineers who think that you have to have a lot of really expensive, great equipment to make a good sounding recording. That's not necessarily true. So if you're thinking that way and you want to learn otherwise, stay tuned. In coming weeks, I'll have something for you, hopefully, that you'll enjoy. But I do appreciate you being here. If you like this, please subscribe and smash that bell button so that you can be notified. You know, share it, let people know. I appreciate very much you sitting through this, and I hope to see you again very soon. Take care.